Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Shape of the Museum conversation with Adam Levine. I'm Kathleen McLean, the AGO's Assistant Curator of Talks and Screenings. Whenever we gather, even virtually, we begin by considering where we are and the responsibilities we have as either guests or hosts on this territory, and our responsibilities as treaty people. The AGO operates on land that's the territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga Nation, and was also the territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is also governed by a treaty between the federal government of Canada and the Mississaugas of the Credit Anishinaabe Nation. So today, I'm super happy to be joined by the AGO's Assistant Curator of European Art, Adam Levine. We'll talk about some objects in the AGO's European collection that offer links to the transatlantic slave trade and colonization and what it means to look at European art on Indigenous lands. So Adam, thank you for doing this. And I wondered if
hello, Kathleen.
Hi. Could you maybe, just to start us off, describe your role at the AGO and what you see as the goal of your work?
Happily, and thank you so much for having me. So I'm one of two curators of European art at the AGO, and I look after some of the oldest material in the museum, art from the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and Baroque periods. It's my job as a curator and an art historian to study art and art making and the conditions of art making to understand the society that produced it, and to make this knowledge available and interesting and accessible to our visitors. I love art, but I really think of myself as a social historian. I'm interested in how people lived, the objects that they made, and what they tell us about different societies and communities at different times. And my main reason for studying history and art history is to understand how we arrived at the present day. And the present day that I'm trying to understand through my work is one where race, a social construction, and pseudoscience fabricated by European colonizers is still alive and well in our minds, and it still dictates that white people wield more power, more wealth, live longer with more agency than the descendants of the indigenous people who were here when Columbus and Champlain arrived, and the descendants of enslaved people who were brought here from Africa against their will. So that's really how I conceive of my work.
Okay. Good starting point. So I should also mention to those of you've joined us online, at the bottom of your screen, there's a tiny Q&A box. Please use that box to ask questions. We're going to talk for about half an hour, but always happy to hear from you with any questions you might have. So in a recent talk, Adam, that you did at the AGO, you talked about a piece of gold bullion that sits in the collector's cabinet near the entrance to the Thompson Collection of European Art, and how you felt that it needs to sit at the center of how we think about European art at the AGO. So the question is, why?
All right, well, I'll share that so you can see it. Is it up?
Yes.
So as museums around the world answer calls for them to change and to address systemic racism, I think it's really important that these changes happen in every gallery. So this obviously includes the historic European galleries that I curate. I think that visitors have become accustomed to contemporary art and Indigenous and Canadian galleries and museums as places where they are asked to critically engage with racism and legacies of colonization, but they still think about European art galleries as a place where they can or should quietly contemplate apolitical, beautiful things. And this is unsurprising because the enormous and complex machine of colonization located much of its violence on the Americas and Africa and insulated the European beneficiaries of the system from its physical and psychic harm. So European art rarely makes explicit mention of colonization, but I think it's my job as a curator to really to sort of sit with this other reading of Europe, of the Renaissance and the Baroque and the Rococo, as societies with tremendous wealth and power who are fueled by resources extracted from colonized indigenous land and produced by slave labor. So I want our European galleries to be, more than anything, places of learning and eventually sites of justice. And this for me is specifically about asking visitors to look at the extracted products of colonization as they appear in European art. So we have this incredible artifact, more than an art object. It's this piece of gold bullion that came from the shipwreck of a Spanish merchant ship called the Nuestra Senora de Atocha, which shipwrecked off of the Florida Keys in 1622. And so if we look at it, it's sort of kind of the shape and size of a hockey puck, and has these different stamps running around the perimeter in the center. And all of these are quality marks from the mint in Colombia, where this gold was mined and refined and processed into the format that we're looking at before it was loaded onto ships that should have left Cuba in September of 1622 and arrived in probably Seville or Cadiz in Spain. And 1622 is an interesting moment in Spain. Philip IV has just become the king of Spain. He's at war with, he's sort of at war in a lot of different sites in the Spanish Empire. He's fighting against Protestant reformers in Northern Europe. And he's looking to sort of aggressively expand in North Africa and throughout the Americas, the sort of Spanish colonial regime. So, and sorry, just to backtrack, this piece of gold that we have came from the shipwreck and was discovered by deep sea archaeologists in the 1980s. So scuba diving archaeologists that investigate shipwrecks. And it's part of the Thompson collection. And so this object is so interesting because it's sort of frozen in time, right? It's being taken from the land of Colombia. It's probably been either taken by, the work was performed by either indigenous or African descended enslaved people working in the Spanish colonies in Colombia. And it's sort of making its journey across the Atlantic. And I think that if it had arrived in Spain, it would have had a couple of different paths. It could have been minted into coins and formed currency in the sort of political wealth of the Spanish Empire. And I think more interesting and relevant for us, or just as interesting and relevant for us, is this possibility that it would have become an artistic material, that it could have been turned into gold leaf for a picture frame or for a piece of furniture, or it could have been pulled into gold thread to make tapestries to decorate the royal palace, or the Escorial, which is the sort of great palace, the palace monastery of the Habsburg Empire. Or, I mean, even if it had become currency, I always like to give the example that it could have formed coins that would have paid Velázquez as court painter of the King of Spain, to make some of the works that we still hold up as some of the great masterpieces of European art. So this piece of gold, it really, it allows us to kind of start connecting some dots and encouraging us to kind of follow the money about what funded and whose work funded some of the works of art that we often hold up as like, some of, I guess what European art curators would want you to believe are some of the most important pieces of art in human history.
Yeah, it's a super interesting object, and I have to say, until you mentioned it, I hadn't really noticed it. It's one of a bunch of things in the collector's cabinet, and I'm right in thinking there's no labels, right? It's just a kind of...
Yes, so the collector's cabinet was intended to, it's just outside of the Thompson European collection on the ground floor of the AGO when you first enter from the Dundas Street entrance. And it was really designed to show the way that the sort of great collector and benefactor of the AGO, Ken Thompson, collected and lived with art at home. I really hope, actually when I interviewed for this job to be curator at the AGO, I mentioned that I really want this piece of gold bullion to sit at the core of a lot of the exhibitions that I do, because I think that it's really one of the most articulate and provoking pieces in the collection, even though it's so small and innocuous, and it's not really an art object.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
And sorry, I did bring two examples of the kinds of works of art that that could have that were certainly made with colonial gold. And sort of if our gold bullion had arrived in Europe, these are some of the artistic objects that that it could have made. On the left, a German cross with enamel and pearls that are probably also colonial pearls, on the right, this English portrait of a gentleman, where we not only have the gold of the frame, but also the gold paint that's used by the artist to sign the work and to make these incredible gold details of the man's costume. And so that sort of allows us also to look a second time at these objects, which feel, you know, kind of beautiful and maybe even innocuous, but now we can start to think of them as being not only made by the artists that made the sort of final version, but also the enslaved labor and the broad network of triangular trade that ultimately produced these pieces in their totality.
Yeah, no, it's easy to see how that object can really help change the stories that museums tell about colonialism in our spaces, in all of our spaces. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how we could imagine a polyphonic or multivocal approach to the European galleries. Like, what might that look like? And yeah, we'll start there.
I think that's a great question. So I'll bring in another piece of artwork in the collection that I'm really excited about. This is our portrait of a lady holding an orange blossom, which we acquired in January. Sort of one of the last real, the most exciting things that I was a part of before we started working from home for COVID. And this painting has, our acquisition has kicked off a major research project that's highly collaborative and interdisciplinary with people in and out of the museum. We've been talking with scholars of race and slavery, botanists, historians of costume, our own head of paintings conservation at the AGO, in and out of Canada, to really try to understand what this painting might have meant in the late 1700s and also what it can mean for us today. Sort of thinking about specifically the different kinds of lives the woman depicted might have lived, what her realities were like, where she lived, what her family was like, the different degrees of agency that she had in her life. We, at the moment, don't know a lot about the picture. We bought it, to be fully transparent, we bought it because we have very few depictions of people of color in our paintings in the European collection. And we really want there to be more. We really want to disrupt the mythology that Europe was ever monolithically a white place. Europe has always been home to people of different ethnic backgrounds. It's been interconnected with a much more global world through trade and cultural exchange, and also through colonization. And so bringing this painting and this woman into our collection allows us to speak a lot more honestly about the variety of people that lived in Europe. And that I think that that also that Blackness has to be central to our understanding of European history. So to answer your question, sorry, this is when we bought the painting, I knew that we knew that there was just no way for us to do this work alone. And that we didn't want to learn about this painting on our own. But actually it's hugely important that many different areas of, people bringing different kinds of knowledge get together to work on building a really fulsome and complex understanding of the painting. And I think that's really the research that I want to be doing, and the work that I want to be doing is collaborative and part of like a noisy in a good way conversation where lots of people want to be heard and also get heard.
Yeah, no, it's a super compelling image, and I'm just wondering because how it went up for a while before we closed, right?
Yeah, it went up in mid-February, so it took some time after we bought it in late January, and I think it really put it up in record time. So for instance, we didn't really have a lot of time to look at it in conservation. Often a piece of a work that we acquire will spend some time in conservation before we put it on view. And a few questions that I have that I will answer as soon as we can get it back in conservation for a short spell is there's a signature at the bottom left of the painting. We haven't really been able to look at it closely. I'd love to look more carefully and try to understand who J. Schul is. And then one thing that I'm really interested in is, so it's a painting of oil on canvas, and the canvas is stretched on these wooden stretchers. And I've wondered for a long time if the type of wood that the stretchers are made from will give us some insight into where the painting was made. So for instance, if they're pine or oak that typically grow in Europe, then it will help us to understand that the painting might have been made in Europe. But if it's a wood that grows in the Caribbean or Southeast Asia, then it can help us to understand that this might have been made in, say, the Dutch colonies, or the lands colonized by the Dutch, or the lands colonized by the Spanish, the French in the Caribbean.
Just Bev Biederman is one of our gallery guides who's watching. Hi, Bev. And she wonders, the question everybody wonders, which is like, what do we know about this, this lady?
So we have been learning a lot very quickly about this lady through our conversations with different experts. And one thing that was interesting to me was that in talking to different historians of costume, they've all told us that the style of the dress that she's wearing is would have been favored. It's sort of a younger woman's dress, and maybe even a girl's dress. And so I think that's really interesting. People had sort of, based just simply looking on the painting, have sort of ballparked her age at all different places. So to know that she's wearing the dress of a girl or a teenager, I think is really interesting. She's holding an orange blossom, which is historically it's understood to be a symbol of loyalty and marriage and purity. So it could be a marriage portrait. We know that this painting is actually one of two, that it has a sort of counterpart picture that it might have been painted, at the same time. And we also know, sort of based on the quality of her dress, the jewelry that she's wearing, that she sort of is connected to wealth. And I say that because I'm still not confident if she was, I don't know if she was enslaved or not. And, if this is clothing that was given to her by the people that enslaved her, or if we can read the sort of quality of her clothing and the cost of all of these materials as sort of placing her within, as a member of a wealthy family. So we are working on it. We're learning more and more every single day. And we've had, in addition to experts, we've had sort of members of the community far and wide emailing and giving different insights. And it's just been really exciting to see what a collaborative project this has been.
It's great to see that level of interest. And actually there's a pile of questions about the painting, and you might not know the answers, but I'll try you. Cynthia Cooper wonders, what's the stone pillar shaped thing in the background? And
sure. That's really interesting. I read it as an obelisk. Other people have told me that they think it's a fountain. Both have been, I've sort of been sitting with both possibilities in my research. I'm working alongside Dr. Monique Johnson, who is interim assistant curator in the department. And she's been doing a tremendous amount of incredible research on the painting. I'm on Team Obelisk, and that's really, it's possible that this is just sort of a fictive landscape, that it's sort of a made up landscape, because it's not hyper specific. The artist hasn't taken great pains to render it with details that would help us to really pinpoint it in a place. But I'm not closed to the possibility of finding, say, a print from the late 18th century that really helps us to kind of connect her to a spot in a city or in a town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so more work to be done. Okay, just actually my next question kind of overlaps with one of the questions in the Q&A box, which is from Brandon Leung. And I was going to ask you about, are there any examples of museums doing kind of creating polyphonic spaces in their galleries that you find inspiring? And Brandon asks about how you see the art museum in comparison to other types of museum, like the ROM, for example, that might provide more context around the social context of its holdings within the exhibition space, and our lines between these different types of museums blurring.
Oh, these are great questions. They're really hard questions.
No pressure.
Yeah, I think, well, certainly we're dealing with a major reckoning around historic sites and monuments as you know, these public spaces for thinking about and talking about history. And so I've been following a lot of conversation about how Thomas Jefferson's home at Monticello can be a place of learning. And I've thought a lot about how we sort of mark land and create space for thinking and talking about the present moment and where it meets the past. I do not think that art, I think that art is always political and always social, always historical. So I don't think that I think that art museums need to be places for social history and conversation and work around, and frankly, revolution. So I don't think that art museums are worse suited than any other museum to be a place where people gather to think and talk about social injustice and to imagine a better world and to build a better world to live in. There are a lot of museums that are doing amazing work. In Europe, there's been a sort of renewed interest in looking at the legacies of slavery, and especially at looking at the presence of Black figures in European art, the depictions of Black people in European art as a way of understanding slavery and free people in European art. Right now, the Rijksmuseum actually has an exhibition up that is looking at the sort of presence of African descended people in Dutch art. There's also an amazing resource, which isn't in a museum, but I think everyone should know about, which is it's a book series that came out of an archive called The Image of the Black in Western Art. And so that's a really, that's an ongoing, I think the project is constantly being edited. I think there's a new edition of the multi-part book that was released fairly recently. And so I think that these are really important resources. And right, I think it I don't know if it will reopen after the museum reopens, but the Isabella Stewart Gardner in Boston just put up a really fascinating exhibition about John Singer Sargent and his relationship. I think it's a romantic relationship with a Black man who worked as a model in a lot of his works. And so that's because they found this incredible archive of drawings and images. And so I think the archive and that sort of detective work so that we can restore important Black historical figures to their rightful place in history needs to be a big part of what museums are doing. And I think art museums are well suited to do it.
Yeah, I'm just noticing a question from Christine Maitland, who wonders about a painting that the AGO has, another painting of female Blackness representation in the AGO's collection, which was The Toilet of Bathsheba. Does that ring a bell with you? Is that in our collection? It's okay if you don't know. You just started here.
I did start in late January.
If you don't know, we can find out for Christine.
Yes, if such a link exists, and if we have it, I'd be happy to talk about it. We have a really fascinating Jerome picture of Zeuxis choosing his models, which is a sort of mythological scene that has, it's like a deeply, deeply anti-Black racial schematic that guides that painting. And we're thinking a lot about how we can change the way that we present it, how we can offer more context to sort of call out and sit with the history and legacies of anti-Blackness that we have in our collection. Another work that we have in our collection that is really fascinating to me is this Peter Claeson's The Elder Moses Breaking the Pharaoh's Crown from Bruges in the mid-16th century. This is a really fascinating picture that I'm working hard to, I'm working with colleagues to edit the label text around this painting so that we can really kind of sit with some of the complexities of this painting, which is that it's, it comes from the Jewish Bible. It tells a story of Moses, who's enslaved with other Jews by the Egyptians, but is adopted and raised as an Egyptian by the Pharaoh's daughter. And in this scene, we see a young Moses being presented a gold platter by a Black boy who we can understand as an enslaved child. And what's so complicated about this painting that I've been thinking about a lot is that, the story of Moses is effectively supposed to be an abolitionist story, or it's supposed to be an anti-slavery story. And yet by the 16th century, Claeson's and the people living in his society understand a logic of slavery that says that Moses is not supposed to be enslaved, but that Black people are not, that are a different race from white people, and that they, that they sort of sit within a subhuman class and deserve to be enslaved. This is all very much in this painting. And I note, because I think it's really interesting thinking about the piece of gold bullion that I mentioned earlier, that the enslaved child is covered in gold, right? He's wearing a gold earring. He has this dagger on his back with a gold handle. He has gold on his stockings, and he's holding a gold tray. So we sort of see his body and extracted gold as being kind of, one merged symbol. So I'm thinking a lot about, not necessarily about taking these paintings down because I don't want to hide this history, but about making these works useful to us in this moment as we're trying to understand where we are, and really trying to sit with and unpack and deconstruct anti-Black racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in the comments, thank you everyone who's piped up. It's Luca Giordano's Toilet of Bathsheba that's in our collection. It does have a Black figure in the back. So I mean, there's lots of material and kind of work that we could be doing to understand more about the people in the paintings.
Thank you. I am. We have actually a huge holding of Luca Giordano paintings, and one of the things that I'm not lying or kidding, as soon as I get back into the building, I am anxious to kind of pull the racks and look through our Giordano pictures for an installation that I'm planning. So watch this space. I'll be looking at that painting. Thank you.
Stay tuned. So as everyone knows, we're in the middle of a global pandemic and also global protests in response to police state violence against Black people. How do we've touched on this already, but how do we attempt to give meaning to a moment like this?
That's a really huge question. Those are two enormous and also deeply interrelated issues, right? COVID and how it affects us all, but also COVID, how it specifically affects communities of color, are kind of tremendous, right? They're really hard to grapple with as a museum. Or at least I'll speak for myself as a curator of European art. I think it's really important when I think about art and art history and anti-Black racism is to recognize that our collections can offer important evidence and context for the long, long history of anti-Black racism. The societies that made the art that I look at invented the false notion that different races of humans exist. Europeans created the sort of differences between categories of humans in order to justify slavery. And these ideas are literally the backbone of the systems that made it possible for Derek Chauvin to keep his knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes until he'd killed him, right? So I really think that this is, it's imperative that that every part of the museum be sort of mobilized to be doing deep thinking about anti-Black racism. And I also think that, frankly, the activism that's happening on the streets is probably more powerful than anything we can do as in a museum. And I think both of those things are true and possible, right? That that we can have a role to play, but also that that policy and social change needs to happen urgently, and those things aren't mutually exclusive.
We have a question from Anupa Pereira who's asking about considering works of art in non-European countries. When museums represent non-European art, they're generally works that show how Europeans or dominant cultures see the non-European world, but not necessarily how they want to tell their stories. So it's kind of a question around representation.
An agency, right? Yeah, I think that that's, if I understand the question correctly, I think it's important that we're not an encyclopedic museum. This is one of the challenges of trying to sort of engage in global history telling, that we don't have a historic collection of, say, Southeast Asian art or East Asian art, and that we have a small collection of African sculpture. So we don't have, say, the same resources as the Met, for instance, of really trying to put different countries and different parts of the world in dialogue with each other. But I think that it's also something that I totally understand the sort of this desire for, say, us not to just limit ourselves to European depictions of say Africans, but also to create a space in our museum for African artists to narrate their experience of Africa and life in Africa. So I sort of, I hope that we can mitigate this, I think, through collecting, but especially through exhibitions, right? And collaborations with other museums who have really strong holdings. I don't mean them as a cop-out. I just think that, we're sort of operating within what's immediately available to us at this moment. And so again, I turn to sort of collaboration as a way of helping us to fill some of our gaps.
So a nice thing about you is that you've expressed some hope that activism can initiate major change across the art world. And I wonder if we can maybe end with a consideration of this question is how can we as people who work in museums help facilitate these changes, or at least not get in the way of these changes?
I am hopeful. I've been made hopeful by a handful of things. One, it was announced that the new head of the Mackenzie is an Indigenous man. This is the first time in Canada, in Canadian history, that we've had an Indigenous director of a museum, of an art museum.
Yeah,
to my
that's
knowledge.
John Hampton. So props to John.
Congratulations to John. That's really exciting. I think that we desperately need to be ethical, equitable, and anti-racist places for visitors and also for employees. We need to, museums in Canada and the United States and sort of globally need to hire, empower, and promote people of color to reset cultural agendas and to make exhibitions that celebrate artists of color. We need to sit in and do hard work about investigating our own internal racism. And there's actually a movement on Instagram right now, a couple of different Instagram accounts that are giving spaces for museum employees of color who have experienced employment discrimination to speak out about their experiences. I'm really heartened that people are having a platform to speak out right now, because it's terrible what is happening and what has happened, the way that people have been treated in the workplace, and this needs to change. And so I'm really excited by the fact that people have an outlet right now to share their experiences, because I hope that these will be a tremendous body of evidence for significant change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Change the Museum is one of those Instagram accounts that I've noticed, but there's probably more. And even though I said that was going to be the last question, Bev Biederman comes in with a final question, which is maybe kind of connects to what we were just talking about. And she brings up the recent Harper's Magazine letter, what I've been referring to as the letter in all caps that is decrying polarization and so-called cancel culture in response to challenges around racism. She asks, are you seeing that problem in museum culture, and how are you affected if so?
Oh, wow. Yes, I mean, there's certainly, I've seen a lot of backlash around statements and opinions that have been published by curators and museum directors. The head of European paintings at the Met, Keith Christensen, had, he's been in the news. He was in the New York Times because of an Instagram post that he had shared where he likened, statues coming down of colonial and racist historical figures as the sort of, I think he said it was the sort of zealousness of the of French revolutionaries, and that these sculptures needed to be protected. I think that now, I mean, I haven't read the letter in full. I've read the coverage around the letter. It's on my list of reading for this weekend. That's not the highlight. That's not my biggest concern right now. My biggest concern is that we confront anti-Black racism.
Yeah, and so I'm looking forward to having more of these conversations with you and our other colleagues in the museum field. But for now, I'm going to thank you for joining us and thank all of you for watching. And Adam, thanks so much for your work.
Thanks, Kathleen. This was really fun. Nice talking to you.
Right, ciao.